initiator and the global coordinator of the 16 Days campaign that has been running since 1991. It's 29 years this year. And the campaign is in 187 countries, at least with 6,000 plus organizations that we know of, right? And currently, really with a reach of about 300 million people. I don't think we have really put that into use the way one would with a campaign, but this is the longest running campaign perhaps in the world. The one thing to recognize is that we have themes that we have every couple of years. And the theme that we have been working on, this is our third year, is around ending violence and harassment in the world of work. And this year we are focusing on the informal women worker. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for having me. I too am happy to be here. My name is Patrice Daniel. I'm a psychotherapist by profession. I'm a master's level clinician trained in psychology and mental health and how individual psychology interacts with the wider society. So I often look at it through lenses of gender, race, sexism, heterosexism, power, and the like. So my area of professional focus is the individual person, individual psychology, yes, but within the larger society, the larger sociocultural context.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Aneesah Abdullah. I work in the Office of the Prime Minister, the Sustainable Development Goals Unit specifically. We're responsible for promoting, monitoring, and reporting on the country's implementation of the SDGs, including SDG 5, which is closely linked to this. In my previous role, I worked specifically on issues pertaining to the advancement of women, as well as pushing back against GBV at the Department of Gender and Family Affairs. And thank you to Alicia for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you all again for being here. I'm just going to dive right in with you, Aneesah, since you were the last to speak, and bringing in the Sustainable Development Goals. Can you tell everyone a little bit about what the Sustainable Development Goals are and what your role is working within the SDG unit in the Office of the Prime Minister right now?
Yeah, definitely. So the SDGs are essentially the second part of a development framework that started in 2000. So you're probably familiar with the Millennium Development Goals, and that came out of the Millennium Declaration. And the SDGs are part of Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. And this agenda was adopted in 2015 by the 193 member states of the United Nations, including the Bahamas. And it's a human rights-based development agenda, so it's grounded in international human rights norms and frameworks. The SDGs themselves represent a results framework, and so it has targets and indicators to monitor the implementation of these SDGs, and they range from no poverty, SDG 1, to eradicating hunger, to promoting quality healthcare, quality education, gender equality, et cetera. I don't want to go down the entire list of 17, but and these goals and targets essentially work towards trying to encourage societies, and this isn't just government focus. It recognizes that to achieve these goals, it requires a whole of society approach. So civil society, the private sector, individuals, wherever you are, academia, the media, all have a role to play in working towards the achievement of these goals. And so in the SDG unit, we're not an implementing agency. So we're not the line ministries who are out there, purchasing the equipment, running services, et cetera. But a key part of our work is advocacy and public education. And so what we're trying to do for different audiences is to make the connection between specific SDGs and their particular roles. So for example, and Alicia took part in this, one of the things we wanted to link was the role of conflict resolution in achieving SDGs 5, 10, and 16. So SDG 5, gender equality and the advancement of women, and 10, the reduction of inequalities, and specifically within groups, not between countries. And SDG 16, the component that has to do with creating peaceful societies. And I think conflict resolution is mentioned once in the whole thing, and that undergirds so many issues. And the idea was to link how interpersonal situations and the inability to resolve conflicts at the interpersonal level, whether that's in intimate partner violence, whether that's between parents and children, whether that's at the workplace, wherever it is, how that can spill over into society and just undermine achievement of the SDGs. And so,
So you
go
talked a
ahead.
lot about the connections between some of these SDGs, right? SDG 5, 10, and 16, I think you said, were related
Yep.
to this, or that's what was the starting point for deciding to do this conflict resolution training.
Yeah.
Can you say more about the connection specifically between 5 and 16?
Yeah.
Well, for those who aren't familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, 5 is gender equality and 16 is peace and justice.
Yeah, and strong institutions. And the
Strong
institutions
institutions,
part is critical. So when we talk about SDG 5, we're really talking about the targets, and the similarities between those two SDGs are actually really in the targets. They both seek to eliminate violence. Obviously, we're not going to do that in the next 10 years, and that's the amount of time remaining on the agenda. But the idea is to institute mechanisms, et cetera, to make sure we strengthen societies and countries' abilities to eradicate gender-based violence and all forms of violence, including against children. And so SDG 5 spells out gender-based violence. SDG 16 spells out violence against children and violence in general within the population. But it also speaks to the enactment of laws and policies and making sure that institutions are adequately resourced to address issues of violence. And so I think that interlinkage, because we can count how many reports of rapes have declined, et cetera. And that's kind of the metrics that we use officially. We do have data challenges, and you alluded to that earlier before we started this call. But, and I think without those institutions, without ensuring that we have those mechanisms in place, those structures in place, that SDG 16 calls for, there's going to be very little effect, I think, towards working towards the eradication of GBV, which SDG 5 calls for. And I think those interlinkages to me are really clear. And I think the listeners will probably, without, you can have these lofty goals, but without the structures to achieve them, they're just goals.
Yeah, and there's so much that's included in gender-based violence. And one of the areas that gets a lot of focus and has always, I think, gotten a lot of focus is domestic violence. It's often considered low-hanging fruit because everyone can kind of agree that domestic violence is wrong and it's something that we need to deal with, yet it's an issue that persists. For some reason. We just can't seem to eradicate it. And we in the Bahamas aren't the only ones who are dealing with this. I think we're kind of up there in the numbers in terms of violence against women in general. But other countries are dealing with this. Patrice is in Barbados. I'd love to bring you in at this point. Patrice, just talk a little bit about what gender-based violence looks like in Barbados, and if there's anything under that kind of umbrella that's considered low-hanging fruit, and how activists and advocates there are addressing it.
It's interesting because it's low-hanging fruit and it's still not, because one would think that everyone would agree that gender-based violence is a problem, but I often see, or in conversations, it's often reflected that it is easier to say that it's a problem than actually behave as though it's a problem. So if a woman is killed or if there is a horrific report of an act of violence, the initial conversation, and I'm not just talking about Barbados, I'm talking about the entire Caribbean, but obviously my context is Barbados. The initial conversation is one that condemns the violence, but quickly it starts to morph into a conversation about something else, where the victim blaming quickly starts and the perpetrator excusing quickly follows that. So I do agree that it's low-hanging fruit on the face of it. It is easy for people to, in the moment, condemn femicides and acts of gender-based violence, but somehow the condemnation turns to something else very quickly. So that is something that activists in Barbados, including me, that's one of the things that we're dealing with, having conversations about the conversations that we have after a perpetrator chooses to kill a woman or chooses to commit an act of abuse. What are the conversations that we have? And are those conversations helpful ones that are going towards the prevention, the elimination, the eradication, the ending of sexual and gender-based violence? Or are they conversations that might make us feel a little better in the moment, but then continue to maintain a sexist and misogynistic status quo, because then we turn around and blame the victim? So that's one of the points of interventions in some of the trainings that I do, where we really examine the sort of things that are said as a result and the sort of narrative that can create consequently.
Can you tell us more about the trainings that you're doing in this area?
So I've done trainings with various Caribbean organizations and networks from Kariwa. I've participated as a facilitator in trainings for UN Women, for WMJ Jamaica, etc. And that is one of the things that is always a rich and stimulating area to talk about how we talk about violence, and how that conversation can either condemn the violence with a goal of ending it, or further perpetuate the violence by maintaining a status quo that supports it, that subtly supports it. So in many trainings and spaces, that's always a rich area of conversation.
And you used the term femicide, which I thought was interesting because it's not a term that we typically use here in the Bahamas. Is it a term that you're seeing being used in other Caribbean countries?
Well, sometimes I do, as in it is not entirely common, but it's not uncommon either. So it wouldn't be surprising either way to sometimes see it in an article, depending, I suppose, on the level of awareness of the person who's writing the article. Or they might just put, a murder or a killing or a life was lost, but not necessarily highlight that this life was lost specifically and particularly because of gender-based ideas and beliefs and assumptions that underpin the killing. That is not just a killing, it is a gender-based killing that is the extreme of misogyny.
Yeah, there's actually a day during the 16 days of activism that's dedicated to awareness of femicide, which is, as Patrice is saying, the gender-based killing of a woman. And that day, I believe, is December 6th. Is that right, Krishanti?
Womantra in Trinidad is an example of an organization that I've heard refer to it specifically as femicide, but as a feminist organization. So they would look at it rightfully so through a gendered lens, yes.
Yeah, I've definitely seen it in their social media posts in the past week for sure.
Yeah.
Krishanti, I guess in talking about combating gender-based violence, we sometimes move towards discussions about peace and peace building, but those terms almost feel foreign in places where war and conflict in the way that we understand it are not happening. So I know that the Feminist Alliance for Rights has been having conversations about peace and sort of redefining peace. Can you tell us more about the way that FAR, or the Feminist Alliance for Rights, is looking at peace?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, I want to really look at the definition of violence against women. That was kind of what came about in 1993, right? And then I will talk a little bit about peace and where kind of this massive gap is. So when the Human Rights Commission back in the day defined gender-based violence or violence against women, it is about the physical, sexual, and psychological violence that women face at home, in the community, and by the state, right? And if you hold that and then you look at peace, I think for us, the Feminist Alliance for Rights, that is housed at the Center for Women's Global Leadership, with the leadership coming from predominantly those from the global south and feminists from marginalized communities of the global north. We wanted to really look at what does peace mean, right? So, and we wanted to look at peace beyond the absence of war, right? There's an assumption that peace is about the absence of war, and women can talk about it, and actually women, men, everyone, right? Trans, non-binary folks can talk about it. That is not how normal humans define peace. It's not just about beyond the absence of war. So to us, the definition of peace includes the realization of human rights. That is civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, right? It is about the right to land, access to resources, ensuring that our climate is okay, right? Children having education, having access to healthcare, right? The right to housing, a right to a job, right? That is what people across the world in places that we have had conversations on the ground define peace, right? And from a feminist standpoint, what we add is that it is about agency, right? It is about inclusion, equality, and non-discrimination, right? It is about accountability, right? And so then you look at what the UN Security Council defines as peace, right? Now, there is the UN Security Council, and they look at its peace and security. However, the emphasis is on security, not necessarily on peace, right? And security then drops to national security, and this is about defense, this is about stopping war. This is not really about the sustainability of peace, right? So there is this disparity in how government bodies come together and define. And of course, the 5 permanent members are the ones led by the United States who won World War II, right? And then you have normal people like us defining peace, which is distinctly different. So here's an example. There was a peace index, and the peace index recognized Iceland as the most peaceful place in the world. It has the highest amount of domestic violence rates in the global north. The second country that was considered most peaceful is New Zealand, again with extremely high rates of domestic violence. So if you think about it, right, the accepted definition of peace doesn't recognize the space to end violence and very systematically to look at violence against women. So I'll stop there until you have another question.
Wow, that whole thing about the peace index is kind of what? I need to look that up. But in doing this kind of work, a lot of it is grueling. A lot of it takes a lot of time and technical ability and people with different skills to come together. And we talked earlier about what is low-hanging fruit, and it often comes down to like what's sexy, what's the sexiest way to approach an issue. Do any of you have any thoughts on the framing of peace building versus and ending gender-based violence?
I'll wait for someone else to go. I'm happy to go. I want to hear from Patrice, actually. First of all, I'm so grateful you're here because I'm based out of the United States. I just want to let you know, it's a time for healing for us, in an unprecedented way. So I'm paying a lot of attention to how my colleagues are doing, my friends are doing, and what my role of peace and sanity is in this world. So I'm grateful to having you here, Patrice.
Thank you. I would be curious about the reasons for the particular terms. So if a particular framework is choosing to use the term peace building, and if another is choosing to use ending gender-based violence. I would wonder if these particular frameworks are using them interchangeably, if there's a particular reason that one is being favored or not. I would just be curious about the usage of the terms and the reasons why, because I thought that was extremely interesting how the idea of peace is not universally understood or universally operationalized. In some spaces, it means a life with access and a life where there's thriving and a life of development in all its manifestations. And in another space, it means just the absence of war and national security. So those are hugely different definitions. So when people are saying ending violence against women or ending gender-based violence and they're saying peace building, what are they meaning and why? And I also know that people sometimes conveniently use terms to obscure what it is that they're doing because they don't want to talk about gender because that's contentious information. So peace sounds nice. So it might be easier to say peace than ending gender-based violence in some spaces. So I would just be curious about the whys and the wherefores before coming to some sort of conclusion about which my feelings about either one.
Yeah, so Alicia, you said that, you know, typically we tend to use things that are sexy and in the moment. And I think for us, you know, framing these conversations within the context of the SDGs has been, we've been able to have those uncomfortable discussions around gender and around certain concepts, around gender-based violence and the root causes of gender-based violence, right? And I think that certain frameworks broadly and development frameworks and these international frameworks sometimes offer an entry point. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals in the preambular section talks about the 5 Ps, right? So that's people, planet, prosperity, partnerships, and peace. And peace is the only one of those Ps. These are critical areas for intervention where they mention violence and they don't talk about conflict. The word conflict isn't mentioned there. And so they're talking about working towards a society free from violence. And there's no limit. And so what I love about these kinds of frameworks is they serve as an avenue to have these kinds of conversations and make those linkages. You don't want it to be so subject to interpretation that people start to narrow definitions either. And so that's what I think is happening in some spaces, even here in the Bahamas, shrinking the definition, for example, of gender-based violence to make it more appealing to certain or palatable to certain audiences versus others. And I think that's a challenge, particularly when those who are doing it are officially tasked with advancing the rights of women in the country. And so that becomes a challenge. I do think that there are different avenues to introduce these issues in a way that stimulates that kind of conversation. And Patrice, it was interesting you mentioned earlier something about the conversation after the event of extreme gender-based violence and the notion of how do we know it's gender-based violence. In fact, there are individuals who are saying that gender-based violence really doesn't exist because there's no way to tell that a woman was killed because she was a woman, as though that is the only definition. But that is, you know, it gives you view into something that's, I view as a little bit frightening, because if you're supposed to be advancing the rights of women and fighting for the rights of survivors and victims of violence, and this is your perception of the issue, I have a challenge with that. And I think this is where education comes into effect and comes into play. And I think partnerships, you know, they play a role in this as well. And civil society has a role to play, to be vocal and consistent in that kind of advocacy. But I think public education is critical, because there are survivors of violence and victims of violence right now who are being silenced and rendered invisible, even more so when you have those who are supposed to be champions being confused about the concept. So conceptual clarity is key as well in terms of advancing this issue and effectively fighting against GBV.
I think it's to me, we have to really look, I mean, governments and at the international level, we also work in silos, right? We complain about it. We need to transcend that. So think about at the international level, we have CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And during the last 2 years, there was this incredible kind of recommendation number 35 that was included, updating what violence against women means. It's extraordinary, right? Now we also have like Security Council Resolution 1325, right? And that is about women, peace, and security, but those of my colleagues and friends who live in occupied territories, who are living in the middle of conflict as well as war, says what 1325 has done is really make war safe for women, not really engaging women in shaping the discourse and the democratic process of a country, right? So and then we have the SDGs, and SDGs, I'm so glad, Nisa, that you brought it up, because it is the current framing. Technically, it is broad enough to hold all of these other aspects, right? And then we have a brand new, another kind of a international labor organization convention called Convention 190 that just came about, that looks at ending violence and harassment, harassment and violence against women and men in the world of work. So there are all these documents, but they don't come together, right? And I think what we have to do, this is where I think the activism, whether you're in government, whether you're in academia, whether you're a service provider, those of us, I think, who have a way in thinking about women, gender, and the complete equality, the comprehensive equality of women, I think we need to somehow figure out how to work together. Right? And I think we have to look at, there's an inextricable link between gender-based violence and women's equality. These two conversations are having separately, right? So everyone is talking about like women's equality from, especially like from a corporate sense, a private space sense, about the importance of women getting jobs, getting, then have equal pay for equal work, employment, all of that, which is fantastic. But you cannot divorce that from gender-based violence, right? So I think we have to really push the envelope on this. And then there are conversations on economic rights without really bringing gender-based violence as well as women's equality. Somehow, and we have to really recognize the role of capitalism as well. Like discrimination in a way is necessary for a market economy. And the non-recognition of women's unpaid care work is massive. Right? It is a massive contribution to the growth of a country that is completely disregarded. So from the get-go, women are considered less than. Our labor is not valued. And when our labor is not valued, we don't appear in the way in which GDP operates, right? So I think feminist economists are doing a great job around saying we have to recognize unpaid care work. We have to ensure there's social protection for women in the informal economy. We have 740 million women, right? Right now, COVID is impacting them, and really looking at where women appear and how to move us and how to amplify our existence. I think that is how I think we might need to really figure out how to proactively address it.
Picking up on some of the points that Krishanti made, Aneesah, I wonder if you can speak a little bit to some of these different mechanisms, the different conventions and declarations that we know that are out there, whether we've ratified them or not, whether we're in alignment with them or not. But there are so many separate pieces. Is it really serving us to have all these different pieces? And how can we make better use of international mechanisms that are meant to help to advance and promote women's rights?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. One of the things that, as Krishanti was talking about unpaid care work and unequal valuing of women's contributions versus men's contributions and anyone else's contributions to society based on whatever characteristic, it was interesting because it goes back to the fundamentals, harmful norms and stereotypes. And I think for example, CEDAW is great, you know, in terms of combating harmful norms and stereotypes. It provides a perfect guide for us as a duty bearer, and I'm speaking as a government official, to actually use that to advance women's rights. But it's also a tool for activists. And I think you guys have been, those of you who are activists on this call, have been using that as a tool. There are regional mechanisms as well, Balem Dopara. I'm not sure that that's well known, but what tends to happen with the international mechanisms at the national level, we don't really see or hear a lot of conversation generated around these mechanisms unless it's following you know, the government's engagement in a constructive dialogue with the committee. So whenever that happens, or as we prepare to go, and then there's a, you know, a press briefing or something, and it with recommendations that say, well, the Bahamas is falling short here, and perhaps it should consider taking these actions. But I think there's a lot of space. There's a lot of opportunities for activism, but also public education. You know, we need to address these harmful norms and stereotypes. We need to talk about these concepts and peel them back. Otherwise, you have individuals defining really important concepts, but not fully understanding them. And so they're conveyed in a very botched way, and individuals they fill these gaps with, just, I don't want to say whatever sentiments, whatever values they may have, or fears they may have, and push back on concepts and ideas about gender equality and the elimination of gender-based violence. And we know this as it relates to marital rape. That's seen as an attack on fundamental religious beliefs. And that's not what it's about at all. But, so I think it's really important that we have conversations about these norms and stereotypes. We need to address these root causes. Otherwise, we're taking it to another level without addressing that fundamental level. I know it sounds basic, but I think it's critical. And when we talk about creating peaceful, inclusive societies, violence is also mentioned in a third SDG, and that's SDG 4. And it has to do with education and ensuring that at all levels, resident citizens of a country have access to education about gender equality, human rights, and sustainable development. That is spelled out in one of the targets for SDG 4. I think it's 4.7. And no, I haven't memorized all the targets, but so I think, it's really important that as we work towards these issues, and it's really important to address that component and make sure that it's embedded in all of our institutions of socialization, and not just have the government saying, hey, this is this, and having a whole bunch of awareness campaigns. And it can't lay predominantly with activists either. It has to be a collective effort.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Aneesah, because yesterday I had the opportunity to talk to somebody from Masai Mara in Kenya. They told that there were 70 girls who were raped and who are pregnant right now because of COVID, right? Their inability to go to school and be in school, and the level of harassment is so high. And that's not just in Kenya, Masai Mara, it's in Sri Lanka, it's in pretty much every place we have had a conversation. We are hearing the level of harassment girls are facing. And it is also normalized, right, including in the United States. And I think we need to have this conversation at a much younger level, right? In 2025, we will have 1 billion girls under the age of 18 and under. And I think we have to figure out how to really respond to them. right? Because we can't continue to have only the conversations and like figuring out. I'm so glad you're in the government and you're speaking the way you are, because it's rare, as you know. And I appreciate that, because I think the political will is seriously lacking across, right? I mean, gender-based violence is not taken seriously. And we have to, I mean, there's a fierce urgency of now. And when I think about, I have two daughters, 13 and 16. The level of harassment they face in Princeton, New Jersey is unprecedented. And they think that they have to take it, right? And so what do we do as adult women? What is our obligation? What is our accountability to ensure that that billion girls, right, in 2025 have a better life than those of us who are now living?
If I could jump in as well, I'm thinking too of what Aneesah said with regard to people not understanding certain concepts. And I know there are cases where that is a legitimate situation, people really don't understand. And I also wonder, especially in spaces with relate to gender, race, and other forms of oppression and marginalization, how often people really don't understand and how often they do not want to understand, and they absolutely refuse to understand, and they use that so-called lack of understanding as a tactic to frustrate the progress and a tactic to delay whatever it is that the traditionally or historically marginalized group is trying to, and currently marginalized group is trying to achieve, because it's such a popular tactic, especially online on the internet, when trolls see lion, that's a term, when you come and you pretend that you don't understand and you force activists and you force feminists to dedicate time and effort to constantly redefining things that have been defined and never being able to push human rights, a rights-based agenda forward, because we're always stuck in the mire of having to prove over and over again. Imagine a conversation in physics where at the beginning of the conversation you had to define gravity every single time and move from that point. And that is what people do. The impetus, and this is just, a general comment because I'm sure you know this, the impetus to maintain the status quo is so strong, and the tricks are so dirty sometimes that it involves exactly that. We're going to be ignorantly blissful, like, but how did we know that it was a gender-based killing? How do we know that he was killed because he was Black? How do we know? And then we get into that conversation instead of accepting what we all know, that this is a murder on the basis of race, it is a lynching, a public execution, is a murder on the basis of gender, and moving forward. So hearing you say that, I just couldn't resist seeing that is something I see online so much, this deliberate ignorance in an attempt to frustrate progress as one of the many horrific tactics used to maintain the status quo.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that, because I don't know if it's a deliberate tactic on the part of the individuals who are claiming it, because that would multiply the concern on my part. Again, these are individuals who are tasked with advancing this issue, who also seem to be undermining the very issue and the very groups that they're tasked with protecting. And so it's really interesting, and it's concerning for me, because this isn't a troll. These aren't people who are uneducated. These aren't people who are illiterate. These aren't people who were just introduced to these issues. And so it does feel very much like, we stepped into a loop that looped us back to 40 years ago. And it is incredibly frustrating for those of us who I think thought we got over this hurdle decades ago, and here we are having that exact conversation. It is frustrating, particularly because of the quarters that these concerns are emanating from.
Alicia, may I say May I offer something?
Sure, yes, please.
Yes. Okay. Well. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Equality Bahamas and Aneesah for bringing this together, and to Krishanti and Patrice and Aneesah for this very rich conversation. It's taken us in so many wonderful and really grounded ways. And I think I don't have much new to offer, but I just want to underscore some of the really significant contributions that have been made already, and just to say that, you know, gender-based violence. I agree that the concept keeps getting turned over and over, but I think we've got to keep it linked to the issue that Krishanti has already brought up, and that is it's linked to gender inequality and discrimination against women and girls. And so I think that link has to really be very clear in our minds as we move forward with gender-based violence. The link, inextricable link between gender inequality and discrimination against women, the devaluing of women and girls on every level, in terms of work, in terms of education, health, access to health resources, etc. Just the entire devaluation of women and girls in return, in terms of the fact that we do most of the unpaid care work and all of that. And so I want to see gender-based violence in the very broad spectrum of physical, sexual, psychological, and economic violence against women. And the fact that it is a human right under the CEDAW Convention to live a life free of gender-based violence, whether it's in so-called conflict areas or wartime or in peace, so-called peace. It's a human right, and that the state party has an obligation, once it's ratified the convention, to prevent, you know, gender-based violence against women. That is an obligation that the state party has, and I think that we as citizens need to be really aware of this obligation and hold our governments accountable for the prevention through policies, laws, programs, public awareness, implementation of laws. And we see very clearly that the at least in the Bahamas, I mean, at the highest level of our constitution, there is gender inequality and discrimination against women, and this has to permeate the rest of the society. And so the norm that we have here in the Bahamas is that it's okay to perpetrate violence against women, because our laws allow it. It allows marital rape, for that matter. And so I think all of this, the linkages need to be very clear, and the concepts that Aneesah has referred to need to be very clear, and we need to use those concepts. They're laid out in CEDAW, laid out in the Belém do Pará as to what gender-based violence is. And so we can't keep, you know, fudging it and trying to get around it. The whole issue of the link between gender-based violence and peace building, I mean, this is really, really critical, because we have to ensure that we keep in mind the connection between gender-based violence and the global military apparatus, you know, that may seem not to be have an impact in the Bahamas, but it certainly does, you know. And just the fact that our young men, you know, carry weapons and assault rifles sometimes. I mean, all of this is really, really important for us as women to understand and appreciate all of those linkages. And so I'm just going to stop there, but I'm really, I think the contributions that have been made by the three guest speakers have been really are excellent and good ground for us to move forward with our activism around the elimination of gender-based violence here regionally and internationally. Thank you.
I'd like to pick up on what you said, Marian. There is, I mean, we know that during war, right, rape is used, and there are more women that are being raped, right? There is, the Secretary General has a special advisor who specifically works on sexual violence in times of conflict, right? And everyone gets really surprised about the level of sexual violence in times of conflicts. And my question is, if women are not safe in times of peace, why are we so surprised that they are the most vulnerable in times of war, right? I mean, even when we think about COVID has shown how incredibly vulnerable women are, right? Home has been not safe for women, right? The public spaces women work in, informal workers, not safe, and they can't be there. Women were the first to lose their jobs. They are also 70% of the frontline workers, right? And they are carrying at least a dual burden of home care, right? Child care, unpaid care, and their own job. And they are the first to leave the formal employment right now, right? And I think we've got to really connect the dots, right? And we have to really come together to look at what does it mean to really recognize what it means to be fully human. And I think women and those in the margin must decide what it means to be fully human. Thank you.
Along with what Marian said, I fully agree, and I want to underscore the point that was made about making sure to maintain the link between femicides and gender-based violence and gender-based inequalities between men and women, misogyny, sexism, etc. Because so often I find that the conversation attempts to divorce the two, it attempts to separate the two, and it attempts to frame a femicide as an individual act and an individual act alone. And an individual act requires being addressed in an individual way. So it is spoken of as though it is just an otherwise reasonable perpetrator who in that moment simply did not know how to control his emotions, etc. So many of these interventions fail to take into account and consideration the entire sociocultural context of gender-based oppressions, and that quite often acts of gender-based violence are choices. They're very deliberate choices. If you look at the media, and I've been involved in a very extensive media monitoring project for the last 8 years or so, so I was constantly immersed in reports that captured accounts of gender-based and sexual violence from the Caribbean region. And when you look at the sort of violence that was taking place, the sort of violence that was being perpetrated, it was often very planned, it was often very deliberate, it was often deployed to maintain the status quo or to right a gender-based wrong, so to speak. So if a woman stepped out of her prescribed gender role by doing something like being accused of cheating or not cooking or something like that, then to reaffirm masculinity, to get back the status quo to a place of comfort, then violence was deployed, murder was deployed. So when interventions simply divorce the act from the context of violence and misogyny and say, oh, well, we'll just teach this person some strategies and we'll teach them how to manage anger, that completely misses the entire context. And we're living at a time, especially because we're having the uprisings against anti-Blackness and white supremacy in the US and the rest of the world. But imagine if those conversations were just framed as individual conflicts. So you execute Black people, you dispose of Black bodies, but the conversation is, well, we just need to teach that person how to manage their anger better. It's not about that. And if we were to have that conversation without acknowledging the anti-Blackness and the white supremacy inherent in the attack and the murder, that would be an exceptionally shallow and useless conversation. And so often I see the same with regard to gender-based violence, where people are unwilling or unable to engage more deeply and look at all of the precursors, look at the misogyny, the sexism, why this person made a deliberate choice to interact with a woman's body in this violent way, and it is divorced from the gender, and just like, let's teach this person a couple strategies. So I fully agree with Marian that we need to continue linking the violence to gender. It is gender based for a reason. And I actually, that is one of the lines in one of my trainings, like keeping the gender in gender based violence.
Hi, everyone. May I just pose a question to the group?
Sure, Lauren.
Okay, so at some point in the summer, the Commissioner of Police in the Bahamas reported that crime was down, right? But around the same time, the Ministry of Social Services reported an increase in cases of domestic abuse, child abuse, etc. So I'm wondering if you all could share your thoughts on the disconnect between crime and gender-based violence, right? It seems as if persons are not understanding this violence as crime. Because how could you report that crime is down when gender-based violence is up?
Yeah, so Aneesah here. So I think that one is kind of, for me, easy to answer because it has to do with the way that the Royal Bahamas Police Force records crime, right? And it's not it's not under the umbrella of gender-based violence. So the two things that they will report are rape, attempted rape. And so you're not going to see things like sexual harassment or domestic violence necessarily. And with social services, I believe that came out of a survey instrument. And the police, it's really interesting because they do track their certain kinds of crimes on a monthly basis to input into their annual report. And necessarily the crime that they keep track of would appear to have been down. There were a lot of lockdowns. Movement was restricted. So those major crimes during that time frame, that wasn't surprising to me necessarily, that they reported, since the lockdowns, crime has been down. Well, no one's been moving around to commit certain crimes. But in terms of gender-based violence, there are specific kinds of crimes that are recorded by the police, and phone calls, etc. We just had this conversation in another setting, that if records were kept in the way that they were intended to be kept, in accordance with the Domestic Violence Protection Orders Act in this country, then you would have a more accurate picture of crime. As far as I know, those records aren't being kept in the way they were designed to be kept under the Act.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, yes, I wasn't surprised that crime was down. You're absolutely right. Like, people were in lockdowns, there were curfews, there was less movement. But I guess, yeah, my concern was just that gender-based violence hasn't been criminalized, right? And so, I think the frustrating part is that while the Bahamas has ratified these various conventions and acts, it's just as well that they wouldn't have, like the government wouldn't have, because nothing's being done. Like, the progress is so slow, and it's not like activists are asking the government to do things that they haven't agreed to do.
Yeah, I think part of it is also the way statistics work. So it's possible for armed robbery, burglary, murder, like all these crimes to decrease, while domestic violence and child abuse increase. So you have an increase in a particular subset of crime, but overall crime is down. Because we get these reports from the police all the time that it's specific, like the crime is down, but we know that the murder rate went up. So this happens a lot, and it's a manipulation of numbers. It's the way that statistics are used and the way that they report them. But to your point on these international mechanisms, I think it's really important that we not only pressure the government to ratify these conventions, but actually participate in the monitoring and ensure that they're implement it, because it's one thing to adopt the SDGs with every other country at the UN, and it's another thing to come back and make sure that citizens know that, hey, we just adopted the SDGs with all these countries. There are these 17 goals, and here's what these goals are all about. That didn't really happen. Now we have the Sustainable Development Goals Unit, which is doing a lot of work to educate the public about the SDGs. They're having webinars, they have committees working on specific subsets of the goals. That's what we need basically for all of these different conventions, and making sure that they're accessible in ways beyond it's available on the internet, but making it easy for people to read and understand what they are and what we need to be holding the government accountable to. And on the other side of that is ensuring that there isn't a fear of international mechanisms, because we do have a fear of that here. And you hear people talking about, oh, these other countries trying to take over the Bahamas, the UN trying to take our sovereignty, you know, things like that. And getting people to understand that that's not what it's about. We have chosen to be a part of the United Nations. We have chosen to ratify and to adopt these different mechanisms because they would be useful for us and move us as a country forward, changing the way that these things are framed and not allowing the opposition to get ahead of us. Because I think that's a problem that we've been facing a lot in combating gender-based violence, in trying to promote women's rights, is that the opposition gets ahead of us way too many times. It happened in the referendum, and it's happened in a lot of different issues that we've been trying to address. We have a couple of comments. I'll just read them. So Stephen said, we have leaders with low emotional IQ, and they do what they can to avoid uncomfortable feelings. Looking at the beast of gender-based violence in the face conjures up discomfort and uncomfortable emotions and feelings. They would rather ignore or minimize the problem than to face it, let alone recognize their contributions or lack thereof to it. And then we have a question from Jennifer. She says, thank you all so much for sharing your expertise. She's wondering, how do we push for gender or feminist policies in government when both the political and public will is so low?
I can comment on Stephen's.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is entirely true. The thing about gender-based violence, and even the gender in gender-based violence and all forms of oppression, is that these conversations become very personal. They can take on the appearance of the political, but we know that the personal is political and vice versa. So when people talk about gender-based violence or any type of gender-based oppression, sexism, misogyny, racism, any ism, it calls for looking internally and considering how you have been complicit in maintaining an oppressive system. And that is not easy for people to do. And there are people who will have that conversation with themselves. They will engage and they will be reflective, and they will say, have I participated in maintaining a society where gender-based violence is permissible? I might not have committed it myself, but did I stay silent when people were making jokes about rape? Did I contribute to a victim blaming conversation, etc.? And there are people that will reflect on that and decide that they will do better going forward, but that doesn't come easy. It is a lot easier for people to deliberately push that information away from themselves, to decide that they're not that person, or decide that they are that person, but being that person is not so bad. So that is an excellent point, that when it comes to these sorts of topics, when we're talking about racism, and people have to look within and explore and examine their own white supremacy and how they have contributed to anti-Blackness, or they have to look at their role in creating a society where perpetrators internalize the sexist norms that we all have helped to create, resulting in horrific rates of rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Like, how did I contribute to this? So it's a lot easier to decide, this is not a problem, I didn't contribute to anything, I'm just going to go along my merry way. And then there's the more insidious side, when there are people who want the status quo to be maintained exactly as it is. They want the world to be racist and anti-Black and patriarchal and sexist and misogynist because they benefit from it given their particular identity. So that's another reason that people don't often like to talk about. Sometimes it is innocently that people cannot grapple, or they're choosing in this moment not to grapple with the discomfort that comes with talking about these things. And sometimes people don't want to talk about them because they want the world to stay exactly as it is, because they're benefiting from their position and their identity in a world that is patriarchal and white supremacist.
I know we are out of time, but may I respond to Jennifer really quickly?
Sure.
Okay. So just piggybacking on Patrice, I think we need to recognize that discrimination is not a result of an accident. It is designed to be kind of exclusionary, right? I think if we recognize that it's not just, it so happened that somebody's discriminated. Discrimination is designed, right? I think, first of all, we have to really recognize that no matter where we land, right? Therefore, we have to be very conscious and deliberate in breaking it down, right? And into doing that, there are the policies in place, right? There are international norms and standards that we can learn from, right? But there's also the space around really looking at not waiting. I think the way in which we work with governments typically is to say, oh, you haven't done X, Y, and Z, right? And when it comes to even reporting of CEDAW, you look at the government says what they have done, and we go and tell the CEDAW committee what they haven't done, right? But we have to localize international norms and standards. We have to start at a city level. So if anyone is interested in learning about it, I'm happy to kind of provide you information. As you know, the United States did not ratify CEDAW, has not ratified it. We are the only industrialized country not to do so. But there's a movement, and the cities have changed because cities have adopted CEDAW. That proactively, they have engaged in addressing discrimination, which has been designed, right? And so that is, I think there's a bottom-up approach to these international standards I think we have to look at. And the other is really shifting the discourse, right? And I think shifting how the culture, the social norms, right, continuously normalize gender-based discrimination and violence. This is where I think the role of media is very critical in really working with the media, which is also difficult. It's not that easy, right? And I think that's where also the public education comes in, right? And I think in order to change norms and behavior, we have to look at it from the point of view of education, right? So on one sense, we have to challenge and demand accountability. On the other side, we have to be proactive in trying to shift the qualitative ways in which people treat each other. Thank you.
Krishanti, I think you brought a lot of the points from the whole conversation home for us, right? There's so much to be said about what Patrice said earlier, that these are no accidents. Discrimination is not accidental, it's intentional. Violence against women is intentional. Gender-based violence is intentional, and we have to be careful not to get caught up redefining things, as she said, that we've already defined. And yes, there are people who don't know, and we do have to start engaging people at younger ages and in different spaces, but we also have to recognize when our energy is being intentionally depleted. There's a lot of action, there's a lot of behavior coming from oppositional forces that is intended to cause us harm and to stop us from doing the work that we're doing. So I think that the takeaway here is to stay focused and not change course, and to make sure that we keep the gender in gender-based violence and focus on what peace really means, expanding that definition of peace, and working towards building peace with a specific gender lens. Aneesah, Patrice and Krishanti, I thank you so much for joining us, and I invite you to make any other burning statements that you have that you want to leave everybody with, if there's anything.
Thank you. It's been lovely to spend this evening with all of you.
Thanks so much for joining us. And
Yeah,
Aneesah,
thank you,
Patrice, any
Alicia. I mean,
final?
it's been an awesome conversation. I don't know if it sounded like someone was talking just now, but it's been an amazing conversation, and I think it's always great to be in spaces where individuals, you don't have to translate a lot of what you're saying. So, and but everyone's on the same page, working in our own way towards the same ends. And so I think it's important for us, while we remain in our spaces, no matter how short or long that may be, that we continue to do what we're doing.
Thank you as well. I too am appreciative of having been here and having been able to engage and converse with you all. It was a useful and productive time. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And that's it for me.
Thank you again. All three of you are amazing. Lots of little nuggets to take away. I have recorded this session. I'm probably going to watch it like 2 times to take notes and be able to share with everyone. Everyone else who's joining us, thank you so much for being here and being a part of the discussion in the chat. We have lots of other events lined up for the remaining days and 16 days campaign. Tomorrow, for all parents, guardians, teachers, anyone working with young people, we have a great session lined up with Taitu Heron, who is the head of the Women in Development Unit at the University of the West Indies. She is from Jamaica, based in Barbados, and she's going to be running a workshop to give you some tools for talking to young people about healthy relationships. So I know here that's something that we don't really do, unless it's you know, the two boys don't mix books and two bees don't mix books and boys. But having real conversations with young people about how to build healthy relationships, how to identify red flags, learning consent. She's going to guide you through all of that tomorrow at 12. To register for that one, you go to tiny.cc/talk2children. Sunday, we have a great session lined up with Carla Moore, More Talk JA in Jamaica. She is going to be leading a session on personal trauma and power, and how a lot of us come to this kind of work, activism, advocacy, through our own trauma. So how do we work through that and ensure that that trauma is not causing us to misuse power or fail to take power when it's available to us? That should be an interesting session, and her session will be followed by some breath work with Micah, better known as Bahama Hoop Yogi on Instagram. And there are lots of other events. We're going to be talking about masculinity, the LGBTQ community, campaigning to criminalize marital rape. You can find out more about all of these events on our Facebook page, facebook.com/equality242. You can also get a list of all of the events and the Zoom links and just register for all of them at once. tiny.cc/16 days registration. That is it. Have a great evening. Enjoy the rest of your waking hours. Sleep well. And hopefully we will see some of you or your friends who are parents and guardians tomorrow at 12. Bye, everybody.
Hi, thank you.